Hello and welcome to The Agenda. I'm Stephen Cole. As the crisis in Ukraine escalates, what does this mean for the future of Europe? Are we, as some claim, facing a new world disorder? The conflict in Ukraine is showing few signs of subsiding, indeed quite the reverse. But just how might it all play out, and what will be the lasting impact on the future of Europe, and indeed the global balance of power, the geopolitics? Joining me to consider those questions and more are Frank Furedi, Emeritus Professor of Sociology at the University of Kent, and Jamie Shea, former Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges at NATO Headquarters. First to you, Professor Furedi. Your recent article, Ukraine and the New World Disorder, where you suggest this whole problem has come about because the US and Russia are trying to decide the future of Europe. How so?
Well, it is a complicated process. It's not as if you can simply blame one side or another. It's not a black and white dynamic that we are seeing. But I think what has occurred is that in the months, maybe even the years leading up to the invasion of the Ukraine, it seems to me that Europe has been pushed out of the scene. The European Union hasn't played very much of a role in all the different negotiations. And what has happened is that, on the one hand, the United States has had this policy that communicates mixed messages. On the one hand, the United States, unfortunately, has signaled the idea that it might be possible for Ukraine to join NATO, thereby making the Russians feel a little bit insecure, making the Russians feel that their security concerns were not being taken seriously by the American president, and at the same time as encouraging the Ukrainians to think that somehow this might be a possibility, that there might be a new regime of cooperation between the West and the Ukraine, integrating the Ukraine much more into the Western political sphere. Biden was also making very, very clear that when push comes to shove, they wouldn't really do very much to defend the Ukraine militarily, and more or less indicating that there is a red line, but when the Russians cross the red line, it will not be met with any serious force by NATO, by the NATO alliance or the United States. So on the one hand, you had that. And at the same time, what you had was, I think, a situation where Russia felt that the West was divided. Russia felt that they weren't being very serious in seeing through the kind of provocations that they felt was being targeted at them. I think especially after Afghanistan and the humiliating withdrawal from Afghanistan, they must have concluded that there was an opportunity there.
Jamie Shea, let's talk about your specialist subject, NATO. Should NATO have taken President Putin's security concerns about expansion more seriously?
Well, Stephen, I think NATO genuinely did. And of course, I lived a lot of this period directly with a front seat at NATO headquarters. For example, after NATO began its enlargement, it explicitly told the Russians that under peaceful circumstances in Europe, it wouldn't put combat troops or nuclear weapons or infrastructure on the territory of the new member states. So this was really about Eastern Europe moving west rather than about NATO in a military sense moving east. And I remember for many years, countries in Central and Eastern Europe that had just joined NATO used to come to my office and complain that they weren't getting the American tanks or the F-16s that they were expecting. NATO deliberately tried to indicate to Moscow that it wasn't threatening its security interests. We had a period where we enlarged NATO, and President Putin came regularly to NATO summit meetings. We had a NATO-Russia Council. We met frequently and cooperated with the Russians in places like Afghanistan or fighting pirates in the Gulf of Aden. And I think, that we also need to remember that Ukraine's wish to join NATO only really became active after 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea, and the Ukrainians, fearing a threat from Russia, then changed their constitution to open the perspective of NATO membership. So in a way, President Putin is like the sort of pyrotechnic firefighter who causes the problems
Jamie, I think Frank is also saying that Moscow detected a lack of Western resolve.
I agree with Frank on that. I definitely think that Putin did see the Trump years as implying that the United States was no longer committed to NATO. I also agree with Frank that Putin probably thought that the Europeans were so dependent upon Russian gas and oil or Russian money that they would never rally towards any serious sanctions. And I think probably he's been surprised by the draconian nature of the sanctions as well. But what Putin should have realized, of course, is that Afghanistan is vastly different from NATO's core mission of collective defense. Many allies saw Afghanistan as a voluntary mission where they didn't have to go. But when it comes to collective defense, everybody feels they're very much in the same boat.
Do you think Mr. Putin will have been surprised by the turnaround and a resolve that has been shown by the West?
I think so. I think there was a very clear perception on the part of Putin and his colleagues that the West was divided, that the West was in a sense not in a position to kind of respond to his assault on the Ukraine with any serious force, and I must have been shocked by the way in which sanctions were immediately imposed. Having said that, I would say that it's still not the case that the unity has been cemented in a way that is absolutely solid. I think there are still hesitancy on the part of different NATO members in the way that they are responding to Russia. For example, I think the Germans, are still very reluctant to cut down or reduce and substantially reduce their energy dependence upon Russia. So there's still the element of hesitancy there, and I think that. So long as America and so long as NATO, in a sense, leave the military option off the table, that unity will not be seriously tested, because I think it's one thing to unite on providing relief aid for refugees, and it's one thing to put sanctions on individual oligarchs. It's quite another thing to take that next step in a unified way against the threat.
And Jamie, we all thought, speaking collectively, that the Cold War was over. But in fact, this may well have started a new geopolitical Cold War. And I'm thinking about what the Chinese ambassador to the United Nations, who in the last few days said that in order to find a solution, you need to abandon the Cold War mentality. Is that right? Do we have to abandon a Cold War mentality? And how much of NATO's existence is down to a Cold War mentality?
Well, I certainly feel that we are going to obviously be in a much more confrontational posture with Russia. I think that is just the reality, Stephen, that's going to result from this crisis. I mean, Russia clearly has made it, Putin has said many times that it's not happy with NATO. It's not just NATO enlargement that Putin is against, it's NATO per se, that he still regards as an adversary. Putin has made it clear that he wants not simply to bring Ukraine back into the Russian fold, but to overturn the entire European security order. I mean, he's made demands on NATO to stop defending half of its membership, which would clearly sort of be tantamount to the disintegration of NATO per se.
Did he have legitimate security concerns?
Challenging the West in Africa and the Middle East and elsewhere. So I think we have to wake up to the fact that we have a Russia problem, and it's going to take a long time. And I agree with Frank in the sense that we're going to have to stay united, not just for the short term, but the long haul, before we are able to sort of deal effectively with Russia. So certain aspects of Cold War containment, yes, I think are going to have to come back.
Did he have legitimate concerns about security on his borders?
Yes.
Well, again, if you look at the situation before Putin invaded Ukraine, NATO had only 4,000 troops. I mean, that's hardly a serious combat force to challenge Russia. As a tripwire stationed in the Baltic states and in Poland, multinational battalions, we had, NATO, very few forces in the Black Sea area, and those forces were rotational. They weren't permanent, and they weren't heavily armed either. With little air support. So I don't think Putin, looking out, seeing Finland and Sweden still outside NATO, would have thought that NATO posed any kind of military threat.
Well, I think that Jamie is right when he said earlier on about how NATO went out of its way not to put pressure on Russia. And certainly until the Maidan Revolution, there was a kind of understanding that NATO wasn't going to expand into Ukraine, wasn't going to create any kind of pressure on Russia. I think laterally that has changed. I think one of the things that has occurred in recent years is that the State Department in the United States has become much more ambivalent about some of these promises that were made in the past. I think it's very tragic and unfortunate that Russia and the Ukraine became entwined in American domestic politics during the Trump years and even now, to the point at which a lot of policymakers failed to make a distinction between geopolitical interests and what was taking place domestically in Washington. And I think that to some extent there's a sense in which Russian insecurity is understandable in light of some of the changing postures that developed within the United States in particular. And I think that doesn't excuse anything in terms of the invasion of the Ukraine, but I think it does provide a context as to why it is that the balance of power situation unraveled so fast in recent months.
Okay, let's talk about the geopolitics and the possibility of the change in geopolitics because of the invasion. As you both know, Sergei Lavrov, he's an extremely experienced foreign secretary, Russian foreign minister, and he said if the West decides to drop a new Iron Curtain on Russia, Russia won't be too worried. He says they'll just look for development opportunities elsewhere. Now, what do you think that says about the sanctions and the pressure that's being brought to bear on Russia in the last few weeks, and how will it change the geopolitics? First of all, Frank, and then Jamie.
I think there's an element of bluffing there because the idea that somehow Russia is going to move entirely eastwards and maybe forge a new relationship with China is not something that is realistic in the long run. And of course, Russia can take a lot of punishment in terms of sanctions. It's not a democratically accountable system where public pressure has got the same role as here in the West. But I do think that what's been happening by the Russian sort of oligarchy is an attempt to kind of create the impression that they're not particularly bothered by anything that's been thrown at them. They can easily readjust and redeploy their resources elsewhere. I think that is just merely an element of bluffing to kind of create the conditions where they can negotiate maybe later on this basis.
All right, Jamie, just rhetoric?
Well, I totally agree with Frank on that. I think the bluster is part of the Kremlin's playbook of trying to appear unconcerned and nonchalant. But Russia, it sends well over 50% of its oil and gas to the West, even oil to the United States, which the Americans are now trying to shut down. And China is not going to be able to substitute entirely for the finance, the energy revenues, the technology that Russia is going to be losing as a result of sanctions. The Russian oligarchs don't have their money in renminbi in banks in Beijing. They have that money in euros and pounds and dollars in the West. Wang Yi, the foreign minister, state councillor, has spoken about the need to respect the territorial sovereignty of states. I think that Beijing will be a bit hesitant about being dragged in to every piece of reckless adventurism by Putin. It wants to be a responsible international actor.
I just want to get personal for my last question to both of you. American officials say they're very worried about Mr. Putin's state of mind. They say he's isolated. They say he's out of touch. And if he is prone, as the American officials are alleging, if he is prone to miscalculation, has the use of nuclear weapons become conceivable? And Jamie first.
Well, I think a lot of it is bluster. As Frank was saying earlier, designed to intimidate us, to frighten us. I mean, President Putin has been waving the nuclear weapon around for years. He even mentioned nuclear strikes when he gave a speech to a group of Russian Boy Scouts a couple of years ago. So this is not new. And I think the calm, measured way in which the West has responded, the fact that the United States this week has cancelled ballistic missile tests so that there could be no misreading of Western restraint is the right way to go.
I am a little bit worried, but maybe that's because I'm an East European by birth, and I've seen how these things can very easily get out of hand. And we should be a little bit concerned that the idea of a nuclear war is not something that is merely a dystopian vision that's entirely confined to Hollywood films.
Frank Furedi and Jamie Shea, thank you both very much for joining us on The Agenda. Still to come here on The Agenda. As hundreds of thousands of people flee the Russian advance, what should the world be doing to help Ukrainian refugees?
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
Unprecedented scenes that we saw.
The cleanup operation is now well and truly underway.
Parts of southern Europe remain in a state of emergency.
Context gives meaning. People make history.
Far more than 1,000 people have come here today.
But authorities are still on high alert.
So now we've actually become the border on this road.
A complex world demands a comprehensive view.
But with the cleanup efforts more or less under control,
The economic impact is bound to ripple across the country.
There's plastic pollution everywhere.
Because the world today matters for your world tomorrow.
This is the living area of the crew.
The focus is firmly on future technologies.
Well, this is something completely different.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Roger, repeat loud and clear.
we can try out the wild and the crazy ideas.
Nothing can stop an idea whose time is coming. This idea is coming.
I actually feel quite comfortable in isolation.
We should all be very basic when we're trying to save the world.
Awesome!
We hope it will happen. We have to live in hope.
Mari, what would you say is a good question?
Stephen, I'd say it's one where there's always more than one answer.
The Answers Project is a new podcast series from CGTN Europe. With me, Stephen Cole.
And me, Mari Beveridge. In each episode, we'll take a complex question.
And with the help of some of the world's foremost experts, shine light on some of the answers. So join us for The Answers Project.
Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to The Agenda. In just over a week since Russian soldiers moved into Ukraine, more than 1 million Ukrainians have fled their country, the majority into Poland. The head of the UN's refugee agency, Filippo Grandi, has said in his more than 40 years working on refugee emergencies, he's rarely seen so rapid an exodus. So just how is this refugee crisis likely to play out from here? Joining me now from New York is global spokesperson for the UNHCR, Kathryn Mahoney. Kathryn, 1 million people, probably more than that, that's the latest figure, have moved out of Ukraine at great speed. This is unprecedented, isn't it?
Absolutely correct, Stephen. Thanks for having me. As you said, this is Europe's largest refugee crisis this century. And most of us here at UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, we've never seen the likes of such a rapid exodus before. And it's important to recall that these are 1 million people who have fled, 1 million women, 1 million children, elderly people, disabled. And these are the refugees that have made it to safety into neighboring countries. But I do feel obligated to remind everybody that the crisis continues inside the borders of Ukraine, where the conflict continues to rage as we speak. So as the bombs still fall, as the military offensive continues, we know that until we can silence the guns and return to dialogue and diplomacy, people will continue to flee.
And talking about those displaced internally, what kind of numbers are we talking about?
I'm going to be very honest with you, Stephen. It is very hard for us to tell. We all know that we've seen these images. We know that people are hunkered down in bomb shelters, in basements, and subway systems. And the reality is that my colleagues, the humanitarians, and everybody else that are there to try to meet the immense needs inside the country, if the bombs are falling, we also have to take shelter. If we cannot guarantee safe passage, safety for us to be able to deliver aid, it's very hard for us to get an accurate picture in this fluid, violent, insecure situation. So the reality is that we don't exactly know how many folks are in need. We know that the needs are immense. We know that there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who have been uprooted from their homes, that have moved from different parts of the country to find safety elsewhere. Let's not forget, anybody who's been forced to flee because of violence is going to try to stay as close to home as the fighting will allow. But until the violence stops, we don't really have an accurate picture, and we need safety for the humanitarians trying to help Ukrainians on the ground.
And of course, internally, those families will be divided. I suspect the men will be fighting and the women and children will try and find places of safety. Is that what you're seeing?
You know, what we do know about the demographics, about the dynamics of this crisis, is that those who have fled, so of the 1 million refugees who have fled, the vast majority are women and children. Now, of course, women and children have very specific needs when it comes to a conflict zone, when it comes to flight. Women and children are often more, exposed to very specific risks like trafficking, like exploitation. So our teams on the ground are aware of this, and they're looking for this to better protect the women and children who have fled, as this is the majority of the population that we're seeing outside of the country.
As the scourge of refugees, people traffickers, are you trying to educate the refugees to say, stay away from these people, and warning them about what they could get into if they get involved with the people traffickers?
You know, in any situation like this, whether it's Ukraine or anywhere around the world, trafficking is a massive risk. In terms of what we're seeing right now, this is part of a bigger picture of all of the issues that we're trying to educate people on. We're trying to tell Ukrainians what services are available. The needs are immense. People need shelter. People need shoes. People need warmth. It is a frigid winter. Where people are fleeing from and where people are fleeing to. People have immense mental health needs. So trafficking is a massive aspect of this conflict, of this situation, and is one of the very issues that we're trying to watch out for and educate people on. But again, it's part of a massive, our massive response, along with the governments where people are fleeing.
Can I just go back to the beginning and the number of 1 million you're quoting leaving, but Filippo Grandi has estimated up to 4 million could leave. Now, a majority at the moment are going to Poland, but what about the other countries taking these refugees? Slovakia is one, I know Moldova. What's been the impact in those countries and how are they coping? And what are you doing to help them cope?
No, absolutely. And I think we've all seen incredible solidarity, incredible hospitality from the neighboring countries who are opening their borders, who are opening their homes to Ukrainians and others in need. This response is massive. It is so welcome, and we're so appreciative. We're so appreciative of this. But the reality is that such numbers will strain local resources, will strain states' capacities to welcome. And that's absolutely why we need to continue to support these countries so that that warm welcome does not wear out. We've appealed 2 days ago for a massive refugee response. These communities, these countries need support from the international community, and more than anything, they need the crisis to stop. They need the military offensive to stop. If this continues, more people will continue to flee.
You mentioned the physical well-being and women and children needing more perhaps than men. Does that mean they're suffering more mental trauma? And if so, how are you coping with that, and what actions are you taking to help them cope with that?
Absolutely correct. I mean, anybody that is forced into a bunker and is hearing the bombs fall, that is exposed to the sirens, is forced to uproot from their home. These are the invisible wounds of war. We see this in Ukraine. We see this around the world in all of the countries that we work. You know, the WHO estimates that 1 in 5 people who are exposed to war, conflict, violence will suffer, their mental health will suffer from this. That's why we integrate mental health and psychosocial support into our emergency response. We have colleagues on the ground in neighboring countries who are addressing this very issue, who are looking for people who are suffering, whose mental health is suffering and have immediate needs to really treat these invisible wounds.
I mentioned earlier, Kathryn, about women and children trying to get out and leaving men behind. But I've also read reports of women leaving their children at the border and going back to fight. Is there any truth in that?
We're all seeing the same reports. And I think our collective hearts are breaking at any thought of that situation. And that's exactly why we are there at the borders along with the states, looking for unaccompanied children, looking for anybody with an increased risk in this conflict. We have our specialists on the ground. We have our protection people on the ground who are immediately referring anybody who needs it. These are very specific needs and very specific risks, and we are ready to respond, but we need more support to do this.
And when you say you need more support, are you calling on the rest of the world, outside that region perhaps, to do more to help?
Well, like I said, the regional response has been massive. Folks are bringing meals, folks are opening their doors, people are paying for Ukrainians to stay in private hotels. But this has to be an international response. We have appealed as part of the refugee response for $550 million to help send more resources that are immediately needed to respond. We now know that we have 1 million people who have fled, but as you say, we are expecting that this number could go up to 4 million. These countries need support so that this warm welcome does not wear out.
Kathryn Mahoney, Global Spokeswoman for UNHCR, many thanks to you for joining us here on The Agenda.
Thank you, Stephen.
The United Nations Refugee Agency, UNHCR, estimates that after just over a week of fighting, more than 2% of Ukraine's population has been forced out of the country. That's more than 1 million people. Inside Ukraine, there are reports of overcrowded railway stations where women are carrying children wrapped in blankets and dragging wheeled suitcases into their new lives as refugees. Filippo Grandi, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, said, "I've worked in refugee emergencies for almost 40 years, and rarely have I seen an exodus as rapid as this one." The UN Refugee Agency warned that at this rate, the war in Ukraine could cause the biggest refugee crisis this century. The largest exodus of refugees so far this century was from Syria, but even at its height in 2013, it took 3 months for 1 million people to flee the civil war there. The flood of people escaping Ukraine has crossed that mark in just a week, and the flow of people doesn't look like stopping anytime soon. But despite the extraordinary pace and the challenges, the response from governments and local communities in receiving these 1 million refugees has been remarkable. As Mr. Grandi said, however, the way many countries have dealt with the refugee crisis has been heartwarming. But nothing can replace the need for the guns to be silenced, for dialogue and diplomacy to succeed. Peace is the only way to halt this tragedy. Don't forget you can watch everything from past Agenda episodes and find additional exclusive content on our website, cgtn.com/Europe, or on our YouTube channel. And of course, you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, at CGTN Europe. Coming up on a future agenda, solar, wind, tidal, and nuclear. Are Earth's natural resources the only path to a sustainable energy future? But for now, from me, Stephen Cole, and all the Agenda team in London, it's goodbye.